Hello, and welcome to this week's case update with the Liberty Justice Center. I'm Randon Steinhauser, and this week I'm going to be joined with Buck Doherty from the Liberty Justice Center, our senior counsel, who's working on a case related to Mississippi private schools. There is an organization called the Midsouth Association of Independent Schools, which has been allocated close to $10 million in funds, COVID relief funds, that should have been distributed to private schools across the state of Mississippi. Yet an organization called Parents for Public Schools has consistently stood in the way of trying to prevent these funds from being sent to the schools that the funds have been designated for. My conversation with Buck shines a light onto where this case is today and how you can get involved and learn more.
Thank you for having me, Randon.
All right, well, let's jump right into this case. So it involves Mississippi, but there's actually ramifications for other states as well as it relates to COVID dollars that have been allocated towards a student's education, and in this case, related to private education. Can you give us a little bit of background on this case and the work that you've been doing?
Yes, Randon. Our client in this case is the Midsouth Association of Independent Schools. The acronym is MAIS, and we refer to them as MAIS. And as you mentioned, obviously the federal government gave out federal COVID relief funds to all the states, including the state of Mississippi. And through its legislature, they earmarked funds for various private businesses, for public schools, and the like. And they also earmarked $10 million specifically for our client, MAIS. And MAIS has about 120 private schools. Some of those are non-religious and some of those are religious. They're parochial schools, Catholic schools across 3 states. And so the Mississippi legislature thought it would be good for infrastructure development to take these COVID relief funds and to give those funds, $10 million to MAIS. The money was to be audited by both the federal government and the state of Mississippi, and the MAIS member schools could apply to receive, I think, up to $100,000 each for each school for their physical structure, for their infrastructure. And an organization that refers to themselves as Parents for Public Schools filed a lawsuit and said that was unconstitutional because there was a provision in Mississippi's Constitution that was enacted right after the Civil War in 1890 that said funds can't go to a school that's not a free school. And so that particular provision that the plaintiff relied on is referred to as a Blaine Amendment. We'll talk further about that. But MAIS tried to intervene to stop that. Number one, the court would not allow MAIS to intervene, which we are currently on appeal before the Mississippi Supreme Court. And then number two, the court agreed, the trial court agreed with the plaintiff, the Parents for Public School, and said, yeah, MAIS can't get that $10 million of federal funds because this Mississippi Constitution provision says that appropriation of funds can't go to any school that's not a free school. So we're currently at the Mississippi Supreme Court, and briefing will close at the end of September, and then we'll have an opportunity to make, to present our case and to make oral argument.
So many things come to mind. One of the first things that you mentioned was that this is just a case right now that's involving Mississippi, but that the Mid-South Association of Independent Schools represents schools in 2 other states. So Mississippi at this point is kind of on an island where they are one of the only states, I did some research on this, that has not released those COVID funds, those COVID relief funds to private schools in their state. So, the holdup seems to be based on the language of their constitution and the Parents for Public Schools standing in the way of these dollars going toward the schools that I would argue, and you might agree, that these were the schools that likely stayed open and that they had to use their own funds to pay for personal protection equipment and all of the necessities that came with trying to navigate teaching and educating children during the COVID landscape. Have you seen any other states that are still holding on to these COVID funds, or is it really like Mississippi is on their own here?
Yeah, you make a great point. We've not seen other states. Of course, had MAIS been allowed to intervene, we could have developed that record. As it was, it's a limited record factually because it was an accelerated trial under Rule 65. And literally the trial was 57 days after after Parents for Public Schools filed the complaint, we were not allowed to intervene, although we were allowed to stay in the courtroom to watch the evidence being presented. But no, you're right. Mississippi is completely on the fringe when it comes to this. The provision, the Blaine Amendment, that's unconstitutional, is literally the same language and the same constitution that the state of Mississippi enacted in 1890. A number of other states enacted Blaine amendments, but since then, I believe in the 1960s and 70s, most of those other states, changed that Blaine amendment, because that language, where it was really born out of hostility and discrimination towards Catholics, parochial schools, because they dared to educate newly freed slaves after the Civil War. And it wasn't just in the South where these Blaine amendments were enacted; it was all over the country. And so there's a tremendous, terrible history about these Blaine amendments, and Mississippi is still, their constitution is still intact, and we are trying on behalf of MAIS, number one, to show that violates the federal constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and then number two, that MAIS should have received those $10 million in funds for its private schools, and some of them, yes, are religious.
Well, and also, I mean, as we know, we've had the Supreme Court rule that these Blaine amendments are unconstitutional. We had the Espinoza case that came forward and was ruled upon to say that you cannot discriminate against religious parochial schools of any sort, religious, and whether that's Catholic or Jewish schools or Muslim schools, you have to treat them the same way. And so we've seen that precedent set now, but yet Mississippi seems to kind of trying to be making their own rules as it relates to this. And also to think about some of these private schools, again, keeping their doors open during COVID, that $100,000 goes a long way for these schools, right? We see endless amounts of money being poured into government schools or public schools. And now we have these schools who have really stepped up to serve students, and they deserve to have these funds that were allocated towards them. So where does the case stand now? Obviously, it seems absurd that the Midsouth Association would not be allowed to intervene in a case that directly affects the schools that they represent. So where are we in the case, and what should we expect going forward?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, the state of Mississippi and their officials, they made an argument at the lower court, and they made a different argument. They were basically saying that it didn't violate the Mississippi Constitution and that MAIS should have been allowed to get the $10 million. MAIS was going to intervene, and we briefed this before the court that's fine. Yes, MAIS is entitled to the $10 million in federal funds, but the reason is because the Mississippi Constitution violates the U.S. Constitution. That was an argument that the state officials were not making. And so we brought something different to the table. And as you pointed out, the Supreme Court has weighed in on this recently, the cases you mentioned. And so they really fought hard to keep us out, to keep MAIS out of this, which they were rightly entitled to be an intervening defendant, and to say, no, MAIS gets the money, and the Mississippi Constitution needs to be changed because it violates the U.S. Constitution. So currently, the state of Mississippi, the Department of Finance and their officials, they are an appellant, and they brought an appeal. MAIS also is an appellant and brought the appeal at the same time. And briefing is almost closed. Both the state Department of Finance and MAIS has an opportunity at the end of September to file their reply briefs. And once that is filed at the end of September, the Mississippi Supreme Court will then, determine a schedule on oral argument, and all the parties will be able to present oral argument before the Mississippi Supreme Court. So, and depending on how the Mississippi Supreme Court comes down, it's possible, particularly with MAIS's argument on the Blaine Amendment and that it violates the U.S. Constitution, that could be directly appealable to the U.S. Supreme Court on a cert petition. So, you can also get to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, via the state Supreme Courts. So that's still not out of the question. Obviously, we hope to prevail at the Mississippi Supreme Court on MAIS's behalf. MAIS is entitled to the federal money, just like other private businesses were. And it's also important to point out, if MAIS doesn't get the $10 million, the parents for public schools conceded at the trial that the money would not go to public schools. They know it's not going to go to public schools. And in fact, I think the public schools in Mississippi, it was brought out in testimony that they had received over $1 billion with a B
right.
In funds from COVID federal funds. And so this $10 million, if it doesn't go to MAIS, it's not going to go to public schools. It's just not going to, I guess the state of Mississippi and their legislature will have to reappropriate. So it's one of those things where it's really a strange argument that they're making. They're relying on, a constitutional provision in Mississippi's constitution that has a history of discrimination against religious and Catholic schools. It's not a good tradition that you want to be associated with, the public schools in Mississippi would not get this $10 million if MAIS doesn't get it. Right. So it's we feel strongly about education freedom, and those are cases that Liberty Justice Center gets involved in, and certainly this was one that we wanted to get involved in, and so we're proud to be able to stand side by side with MAIS and their team, in this fight.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you make a good point there. It's important to mention, which is how Liberty Justice Center has really been on the front lines of fighting for education opportunity, education freedom. And while this case isn't directly related to kind of the growing movement of school choice, it is related in the sense of these private schools are serving as many families as they can. And we know that when parents have an option and have a choice, freedom of movement to go to private schools, we see increased parent satisfaction rates, increased academic outcomes. And so these schools, once again, they kept their doors open. They're receiving a small portion of what the government schools have received in Mississippi. And it seems like it's far beyond time that the legislature does the right thing, gets these funds out of the state coffers and into the schools that deserve them. So thank you for the update, Buck. And for anybody who's watching, feel free to visit us at libertyjusticecenter.org. We will be keeping you updated on this case, and we'll continue the fight for educational freedom, opportunity, and certainly in this case, equity as well. So thanks for joining, Buck. We'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Randon.